From somewhere deep in the storm that night, two children cried into the snow. A twin's voice, soft, trembling, whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'll take care of him." While the rest of the world slept safe behind locked doors, one retired service dog named Max stood guard on the porch of an old wooden cabin, ears twitching, nose lifted toward the wind, as if listening for a prayer no one else could hear. "Stay with me just 1 minute, and I'll tell you where that trail led. To a place where a forgotten pair of twins met a wounded soldier, and a dog who never forgot what duty meant, even long after the war was over. This isn't only a story about rescue, it's about finding your way home, when home feels lost. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, and may your heart, wherever you are, stay warm and kind." The storm came down from the Montana highlands like a living beast, howling through the bones of the valley and gnawing at the edges of every roof it found. Wind clawed at power lines until they sang a low metallic moan, and the old pine trees bowed as if praying for mercy. Snow swept sideways, thick and endless, turning barns, fences, and parked trucks into buried ghosts. Fairbend, the kind of town you'd miss if you blinked while driving, had gone dark hours ago. One by one, windows surrendered their light, and only the stubborn stayed awake to hear what the mountain had to say. In a cabin near the tree line, Raymond Cole sat by the hearth, one arm resting on the chair's edge, the other idly tracing the scars beneath his sleeve. 58 years old and still built like the soldier he once was. Broad shoulders, steady jaw, eyes that never lost the habit of scanning for exits. His dark skin glowed faintly in the firelight, but there was no softness in his face. He wore a flannel shirt, fatigue pants, and his boots, always his boots. The war had ended decades ago, yet he slept as if the sirens could still come. Across from him, on a faded wool rug, lay Max, the only soul who had followed him home. Max was a German shepherd with a sable coat dusted silver by age, 10 years past his prime, but still watchful, still proud. His left ear drooped slightly, a scar from a blast that had once deafened them both for days. Tonight, he dozed with his head on his paws, but his body stayed tense, as if some part of him was still on duty. Raymond reached down to run a calloused hand over the dog's back, and for a moment, there was peace, the kind you can only borrow from silence. Then Max's ears twitched. He rose slowly at first, nostrils flaring toward the door. The sound was faint, almost imaginary at first, just the wind shifting direction. But then it came again, thin and broken, slipping between gusts of snow. A voice. No, two voices, one high, one smaller, carried by the storm as if the night itself was confessing a secret. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'll take care of him." Raymond froze. The logs popped in the fire, throwing sparks across the hearth. Max barked once, a deep single note that cut through the roar of the blizzard, and then the dog lunged toward the door, muscles coiling like a spring released. "Max!" Raymond shouted, but the shepherd was gone, pushing through the snow curtain and into the dark. Raymond grabbed his rifle from the wall, slung the strap over his shoulder, and snatched the flashlight from the table. The door slammed against the wind as he stepped outside, swallowed by white. The cold hit him like a hammer. It stole his breath, stung his eyes, made his shoulder throb where metal still lived under the skin. But he kept moving, boots crunching through drifts that came up to his knees. The beam of his flashlight cut a trembling line through the storm. Nothing but snow, pine, snow again. "Max," he called, voice shredded by the wind. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then he heard it, a low bark, distant but clear. He pushed forward, Downhill toward the old highway, the outlines of a rusted signpost emerged. Rest stop closed. Since 1998, beneath it, the snow was uneven, as if something, or someone, had disturbed it. He angled the light lower and stopped breathing. Two small figures crouched under a collapsed billboard, huddled together beneath what looked like a torn blanket. The dog stood guard a few feet away, his chest rising and falling fast, his breath visible in sharp bursts of white. Raymond dropped to his knees beside them. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, had her arm wrapped around a smaller boy. Her hair was plastered to her face, lashes frozen, lips blue. The boy's cheek was pressed to her shoulder, eyes half open but unfocused. Snow had already begun to cover them again, as if the world was trying to erase their existence. "Hey, hey! It's all right now," Raymond said, lowering his rifle to the ground. He pulled the blanket away gently, careful not to break what little warmth they still shared. Their clothes were thin, jeans stiff with ice, shoes soaked through. He took off his heavy coat and wrapped it around both children. The girl stirred first, a faint whimper escaping her throat. Don't let the light go," she murmured. Raymond tightened the coat around them. Then the boy blinked, cracked lips moving with effort. "Don't tell her I cried," he whispered, voice as fragile as glass. Something in Raymond's chest buckled, the kind of breaking that makes no sound. The snow, the cold, the night. They all fell away for a second, replaced by another memory. Sand instead of snow. The same smell of metal and fear, and a voice in his headset saying, "We lost the boy, sir." He closed his eyes briefly, forcing the past back into its box. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant the children or himself. He looked to Max. The dog stood still, snow crusting over his fur, eyes locked on Raymond like a soldier awaiting orders. "Home," Raymond said simply. Max turned and led the way, his paw prints filling quickly with white. Raymond lifted the boy into his arms, the girl clutching his sleeve with what little strength she had. The trek back to the cabin was a blur of breath and pain. The wind cut sideways, carrying whispers that weren't words. His shoulder screamed, but the warmth of the small bodies in his arms kept him moving. By the time they reached the porch, Raymond's coat had frozen stiff. Max waited at the door, whining softly. Raymond kicked it open, the sudden rush of firelight flooding the room like dawn. He set the children near the hearth, stripped off the wet layers, and wrapped them in blankets. Max curled at their feet, pressing his body close, his old instincts coming alive again. The protector, the rescuer, the bridge between two worlds. Raymond watched the boy's chest rise, shallow but steady. The girl's hand, small and trembling, reached toward the dog's fur and stayed there. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside the cabin time seemed to slow. The fire crackled, painting their faces in amber light. Raymond knelt beside them, his breath ragged. For years, he'd told himself the world didn't need him anymore, that his job had been to survive, nothing more. Yet now, as the blizzard raged and 2 small lives clung to his presence, he realized war hadn't left him. It had simply changed shape. He looked at Max, his old comrade, his last connection to purpose. The dog's eyes reflected the flame, steady, certain. And in that silence between the wind's roars, Raymond understood that something had called them both out there tonight. Not duty, not habit, something older, something sacred. He reached out, brushing the snow from the boy's hair, and whispered, "You're home, son." The boy stirred, breathing shallow but sure. The girl's eyelids fluttered, a faint sound escaping her lips. Half dream, half promise. The fire popped, a single ember lifting into the air before dying against the stone. Outside, the storm screamed like a ghost, but inside that small cabin, 3 souls and 1 dog sat against the dark, waiting for morning. And though Raymond didn't know it yet, that was the night everything he thought he'd buried would begin to wake again. The storm had quieted to a slow, shivering hum. The world outside was a single shade of white, draped over fences, trees, and the edge of the roof like a great quilt stitched by heaven itself. Inside, the cabin exhaled in small, uneven breaths, the creak of wood expanding in heat, the sigh of the wind against the chimney, the low rhythm of fire burning through its last pieces of pine. Raymond knelt beside the hearth, one knee braced on the rug, watching the 2 small shapes wrapped in wool and silence. They looked too fragile for this world, like snowflakes that had somehow forgotten to melt. Max lay between them and the door, his body a living barrier of warmth. His fur, still damp in patches, steamed faintly under the firelight. His eyes flicked from the children to Raymond, and then back again, never closing, never at ease. Outside, a soft ticking began as icicles loosened their grip on the eaves, melting in slow surrender. The storm had broken, but the night still carried the hush of something unfinished, something holding its breath. Nora woke first. Her eyes opened with the slow wariness of someone who had learned to expect pain before comfort. They were pale green, clear as new leaves in spring, but dull at the edges from exhaustion. She stared at the ceiling beams for a long moment before turning her head toward Max. The old dog didn't move, but his tail brushed the floor once, a quiet signal that the world still recognized her existence. She reached out a trembling hand and buried her fingers in his thick coat, as if to test whether life still held warmth. Raymond watched in silence. He'd seen that same look before, on civilians pulled from rubble, on young soldiers blinking awake after a blast, unsure if they were alive or already gone. He stirred the pot on the stove, the faint aroma of broth filling the air. It wasn't much, just chicken, onion, salt, and the stubborn intention to keep someone breathing. But it was all he had. Noah stirred next, a faint sound between a cough and a sigh. His hand clutched at his sister's sleeve even in half-sleep, knuckles white. He didn't open his eyes, didn't speak. His face was rounder than hers, cheeks still holding the softness of childhood. But there was an edge to his stillness, a learned silence that didn't belong to a boy of 7. Raymond ladled soup into 2 chipped bowls, steam rising like ghosts, and placed them near the fire. He sat across from them on the floor, letting the warmth climb into his bones. "You're safe here," he said quietly. The girl blinked, her lips parting as if to answer, but no words came. Max shifted, resting his chin on his paws, watching her with patient eyes. "You got names?" Raymond asked, his voice gentle like talking to something half wild. Nora hesitated, then whispered, "Nora." A small pause. "And he's Noah." "Good," Raymond said, nodding once. "Names matter. Means someone's still looking for you." Slid the bowl toward her, but she only stared at it. Finally, he picked up the spoon and took a sip himself, exaggerating the motion like a quiet performance. "See? Not poison, just plain old soup." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost not, and she reached for the spoon. Her fingers were thin, red at the joints, trembling. She passed it to Noah, who took it without meeting her eyes. They ate slowly, sharing, the sound of their spoons against the bowl louder than any conversation. On the small wooden table near the wall sat a tin box he hadn't noticed before. It was dented, covered in frost, and bore the faint pattern of something once floral. He brushed away the ice and flipped it open. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, was a faded photograph, a young woman with tired eyes and a smile that looked borrowed from a better time. Her hair was dark, shoulder length, and she held a child in each arm. Beneath the photo lay a folded piece of paper, soft at the edges, written in hurried blue ink. "If something happens, look for your Aunt Clara near Bridger Creek." Raymond stared at the note, his heart giving a slow, painful twist. The handwriting was familiar in a way that memory didn't have to confirm. He set the paper down carefully, as if it might burn. "Clara Wynne," he murmured. The name floated out into the room, too soft for anyone but Max to catch. The dog's ears twitched, sensing the change in the air. He leaned back against the chair, closing his eyes for a moment. Clara Wynne, the field nurse who had patched him up in Iraq after the convoy blast, who had written letters that smelled faintly of lavender and desert dust. He had promised to answer, to visit, to return the kindness that once kept his heart from closing. But life had a way of making cowards out of men who carried too much silence. Nora tilted her head. "Who's that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Raymond opened his eyes and found her watching him, her gaze too steady for someone her age. "An old friend," he said. "Someone I should have written back to." She seemed to accept that. Children often did. They understood regret better than most adults. She looked back at Noah, who had finished half the bowl and was now holding the spoon loosely, eyelids drooping. Raymond rose and grabbed 2 thick blankets from the closet, army issue, olive green, heavy enough to block nightmares if you believed hard enough. He draped one over each child, tucking the edges around their shoulders. Nora's eyes fluttered. "It's warm," she murmured. "Warmer than the laundry room." The words caught him off guard. He looked at her, but her eyes had already closed. He didn't ask what she meant. He could guess. Max settled beside them again, the steady sound of his breathing filling the space between their fragile ones. Raymond walked to the window. Outside, the wind had softened to a whisper, brushing against the glass with long, weary fingers. The trees stood still now, their heavy limbs sagging under fresh snow. The storm had spent itself, but the quiet it left behind wasn't peace. It was a different kind of noise, the one that comes when memory wakes up. He sat at the table again, turning the photograph over in his hands. The woman's face stared back at him, blurred slightly where time had touched it. He could almost hear her laugh, low and breathy, carried on the heat of some faraway desert wind. He remembered how she used to tie her hair back with a strip of gauze, how her hands never shook even when everything else did. And now she was somewhere beyond reach, yet somehow still pulling at the threads of his life. He looked at Max. The dog's eyes reflected the firelight, calm and knowing. "Guess we're going to Bridger Creek," he said softly. Max thumped his tail once, the quiet approval of a comrade. The clock on the mantel ticked, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, the snow began to fall again, light this time, gentle, as if the sky was ashamed of what it had done. Raymond turned down the lantern wick, the room sinking into a dim gold glow. The children slept soundly now, their breathing deep and even. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the small, ordinary sounds of life returning. Wood popping in the stove, wind brushing against the logs. Max's sigh heavy with contentment. For the first time in years, The cabin didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like something alive, something learning how to breathe again. Still, Raymond couldn't shake the name echoing in his chest. Clara Wynne. The letters sounded like a door creaking open in a house he thought was empty. He folded the note, placed it back into the tin box, and closed the lid gently. Outside, the night had gone still, but inside, a different storm had started, one that had nothing to do with wind or snow. It moved quietly, unseen, stirring the dust of all the things Raymond Cole had tried to forget. The morning light broke weakly through the clouds, pale and uncertain, as if the sun itself doubted whether to rise over the frozen valley. The road wound north, narrow and half buried in snow, its edges lost in the hush of white silence. Raymond drove slow, his old truck groaning against the cold. The heater coughed lukewarm air that did little more than fog the glass. Beside him, Noah and Nora sat bundled beneath army blankets, their faces pressed to the frosted window, watching the world pass like a dream they were still half afraid to wake from. Max lay in the back seat, chin resting on his paws, his breath clouding the window pane. His eyes moved between the children and the road, a sentry who trusted no horizon. When Raymond glanced in the rearview mirror, he caught the faintest reflection of his own face, lined, hollow-eyed, yet softer somehow in their company. He tightened his grip on the wheel. The note in his coat pocket felt heavier than it should have. By mid-morning, the landscape began to change. The valley narrowed, giving way to a ridge lined with cottonwoods bent under ice. At the far end stood a small farmhouse, its roof bowed with years, its walls weathered to gray. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin but steady, a sign of persistence rather than comfort. Raymond stopped the truck and killed the engine. For a long moment, no one moved. He stepped out, boots crunching into the crusted snow. The wind had quieted, leaving only the soft ticking of cooling metal and the faint rustle of trees. He walked to the porch, the boards groaning beneath his weight. Before he could lift his hand to knock, the door opened. A woman stood there, tall for her age, her silver hair tied in a low braid that brushed the collar of her wool coat. Her face bore the kind of beauty that time didn't erase, only deepened, line by line, like the rings inside an old tree. Her eyes, gray-green and sharp as firelight, studied him for a heartbeat before flicking to the children. "They're my sisters," she whispered, voice breaking on the word sister. One hand rose to her chest, as if her heart needed reminding that it still existed. "She was dying when she sent them north. I thought—" Her lips trembled, and the sentence fell apart in the quiet. "I thought they never made it." Raymond said nothing. He only nodded once, the kind of gesture that carried more truth than words could. He turned toward the truck, motioning gently. Noah climbed down first, holding Nora's hand as though letting go might undo their survival. Clara Wynne stepped aside without a word, the doorway glowing faintly behind her. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old quilts, of coffee left on the stove too long, and candles burned down to waxy stubs. A single lamp cast soft light over a table littered with letters, half read and folded at the corners. Clara took their coats, her fingers trembling slightly as she brushed the snow from the twins' hair. "She told me to wait," she murmured. "Said she'd send a letter when she was safe." Raymond looked at her, his voice low. "She never made it that far, did she?" Clara shook her head. "No. She called once from a motel off Highway 89. Said she was tired of running. I begged her to come here." She said she couldn't risk it. They'd find her. Take the children. She pressed her hand to her face, and then she was gone. The room seemed to hold its breath. The only sound came from Max, who had followed quietly inside, his claws ticking against the floorboards. He sat near the hearth, gaze fixed on Clara as if recognizing something unspoken between her and his master, a shared understanding of loss and duty. As the children warmed by the fire, Clara poured coffee into two mismatched cups. Her hands were still steady when she worked. Raymond noticed that, the same way he had noticed it years ago when she'd patched his shoulder in the desert. "You still drink it black?" she asked. He met her eyes and gave a small, tired smile. "Old habits." She handed him the cup, her expression softening. "And old debts." They sat across from each other in silence, the weight of 10 unspoken years stretching between them. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low, almost reverent. "After her husband died in that factory accident, the foster people started circling. They said she wasn't stable enough to raise them. She ran, took what she could carry, and vanished. Every letter she sent after that was shorter, shakier, then nothing." Raymond listened without interruption, the coffee cooling in his hand. Nora leaned against his side, eyes half closed. Noah sat close to Max, his small fingers tracing the old dog's ear, the simple rhythm grounding him. The world outside had grown quiet again, muffled under a new blanket of snow. When Clara's voice broke, she didn't hide it. "I should have gone after her," she said. "But I was tired. Too tired to fight another system that eats the poor alive." She looked toward the twins, her tears catching the light. "And now she's gone, and they don't even know what kindness is supposed to sound like." Raymond set his cup down, the faint clink sharp in the hush. "You can still show them," he said softly. Clara looked at him, really looked, as if measuring whether she still believed in redemption. "You were always better at saving people than believing you could." He smiled faintly, that old rueful curve of the mouth that had survived every battle but one. "Maybe I just got tired of losing them." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked, sending a small burst of sparks up the chimney. Max lifted his muzzle and let out a low, mournful howl, one long note that trembled through the rafters. It was the sound of recognition, of something sacred and sorrowful being named without words. Clara's hand covered her mouth, as if to keep from sobbing aloud. When the sound faded, the house sank into stillness. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, listening. Raymond rose and walked to the window. The sky had turned the pale blue of dying daylight, clouds bruised with the promise of more snow. He was about to draw the curtain when a faint vibration reached through the glass. A hum, then another. Headlights crested the hill in the distance, two beams cutting through the gray. They moved slow, deliberate, like someone who already knew where to stop. The sound of an engine rolled across the valley, low and steady, echoing against the frozen ridge. Max stood, his fur bristling along his back. The twins froze, eyes wide, instinct stronger than understanding. Clara's voice was a whisper. "No one comes up here in winter." Raymond didn't answer. He set his cup down quietly, the porcelain clicking against the table. The reflection of those headlights swelled in the window glass, bright as twin ghosts. Somebody had found them. Morning crept over the ridge slowly, pale and thin, its light crawling across the frost-glazed windows of Clara's farmhouse. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind a silence so heavy that even the trees seemed to hesitate before breathing. Raymond stood by the stove, pouring black coffee into two chipped mugs, while Max rested by the door, his head up, his body alert. Something about the air felt different, charged, waiting. Clara moved quietly through the kitchen, her silver hair pulled back, eyes tired but steady. The children were still asleep on the couch under the heavy wool blanket, faces soft in dreams that rarely came easy. The first sound was the low hum of an engine climbing the ridge road. It broke the quiet like a saw through bone. Raymond's eyes flicked toward the window. A black SUV rolled slowly into view, its tires chewing through the snow with deliberate calm. Max's ears rose, his body stiffening. "We've got company," Raymond muttered, his voice flat, resigned. Clara didn't answer. She reached for her shawl and pulled it tight around her shoulders, as if bracing for something she already knew was coming. When the knock came, it wasn't polite. It was the kind of knock that expected obedience. Raymond opened the door halfway, keeping his shoulder against it like a shield. The cold rushed in first, followed by the smell of expensive perfume. Roses with something metallic beneath. The scent of money trying to hide the rot underneath. A woman stood on the porch, tall, angular, her coat too fine for this part of the state. Her hair was the color of champagne and sprayed into submission. Her lips painted a shade too bright for mourning. Ruth Porter, late 40s, wore her privilege like armor. Behind her stood a man, Glenn Porter, broad-shouldered but soft in the middle, his suit jacket straining at the buttons, his face all square angles and disdain. His gloved hand reached out automatically. It was the kind of handshake that offered no warmth, only measurement. "They're ours by paper," Ruth said before Raymond could speak. Her voice carried a brittle confidence, practiced and sharp. "You're harboring state property." Raymond's jaw tightened, his hand still on the doorframe. "Children aren't property," he said evenly, each word landing with the weight of something he'd learned the hard way. Behind him, Nora stirred on the couch. Noah sat up, blinking, confusion and fear creeping into his face. Max moved closer, the low rumble in his chest rising like thunder caught behind the ribs. His fur stood slightly along his neck, his eyes locked on the stranger's. Ruth's gaze swept past Raymond, lingering on the children. "Look at them," she said, half laughing, half scolding. "Frozen little things. We take them in, give them clothes, food, a bed, and they run away to play house with a washed-up soldier in a shack. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in?" Raymond didn't flinch. "You'll need to talk quieter," he said, voice calm. "There's a dog between you and those kids, and he's not fond of loud noises." For the first time, Glenn shifted uneasily. His eyes dropped to Max, an aging German shepherd but still massive, his coat gleaming sable and silver in the morning light. The dog didn't growl this time. He just stared, unblinking, a silent warning carved in fur and muscle. "Mr. Cole," a new voice interjected, cutting the tension before it could ignite. From behind, the Porters stepped a woman. Early 30s, auburn hair tucked under a wool hat, cheeks flushed from the cold. Anna Reese, her badge pinned to her coat, her expression measured but not unkind. She nodded once toward Raymond. "Morning. I'm with Child Services out of Sheridan County." Mrs. Porter, her tone shifted, cool and deliberate. "There's already an open neglect report on your household. You were told not to make contact until the review was closed." Ruth turned sharply, her smile faltering. "Excuse me?" Anna's eyes hardened, the warmth gone. "We received multiple complaints. Neighbors, teachers, even your housekeeper. You can call my office if you'd like confirmation. The air between them crackled. Raymond didn't move, didn't need to. The room had already chosen its truth. Clara appeared in the doorway behind him, her presence calm but commanding, a woman who had lived long enough to know when a storm was turning. "You should go," she said quietly. "You've frightened the children enough." Ruth's painted lips tightened. "You think a broken soldier and an old woman can raise them? What are you? Some charity for lost causes?" Raymond didn't speak. The words didn't touch him, but Max did. His growl rolled out low and steady, a sound that made the air itself seem to draw back. The dog's stance was clear. "One step closer, and you'll regret remembering how to move." Glenn stepped forward, puffing his chest, but stopped when Anna raised her hand. "Enough," the social worker said sharply. "You've made your point. Now leave before you make this worse." Ruth stared at her in disbelief. "Do you know who we are?" Anna's voice was steady. "People who forgot what love meant." The silence that followed was brittle as the ice on the porch. Ruth looked from Raymond to Clara, then to the children. Two small figures huddled together under a wool blanket, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Something flickered in her eyes, not remorse, but the faint sting of being seen too clearly. She turned abruptly, coat flaring behind her. Glenn followed, muttering under his breath. When the door closed, the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. The world outside felt heavy again, the kind of quiet that hides echoes of words no one wanted to say. Anna took off her hat and exhaled, her breath visible in the cold that had slipped in through the seams. "I'll file the notice today," she said softly, glancing toward Raymond. "They'll come back with lawyers, with papers, with everything money can buy. You better be ready. This fight won't end here." Raymond met her gaze. For a moment, the soldier in him, scarred, patient, stubborn, rose to the surface. "I fought harder ones," he said simply. Anna studied him, then nodded. "Good." She bent down, offering her hand to Nora and Noah. "You two stay strong, okay? Mr. Cole and I. We'll make sure you're safe." Nora nodded, eyes wide. Noah didn't move, but his hand found Max's collar again, holding tight. The dog turned his head slightly, pressing his muzzle against the boy's arm, a gesture both grounding and protective. Outside, the SUV's tires spun briefly in the snow before catching traction and vanishing down the hill. Anna lingered near the doorway for a moment longer, writing something in her small notebook before tucking it away. Then she turned to Raymond. "You've got good instincts. Just don't let them make you forget why you're fighting." He gave a slow nod. "For them," he said. Anna smiled faintly. "That's the only answer that ever matters." She left without another word. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, Clara crossed the room and placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder. "You meant what you said," she murmured. "You really think you can win?" He looked toward the children, huddled close to the old dog, eyes still shadowed but alive in a way they hadn't been days before. "Win?" he said, his voice low. "I don't care about winning. I just don't lose children." Outside, the snow began to fall again. Thin, slow, like ash drifting from an unseen fire. Inside, the house breathed as one. An old woman, a soldier, a dog, and two children who had already learned what survival costs. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of the SUV's engine lingered long after it was gone, like a promise waiting to be broken. The snow had melted just enough to turn the courthouse steps into shallow pools of gray water. Clouds hung low over Sheridan County. pressing down on the small town like a weight that refused to lift. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of wet wool, old pine polish, and nerves. Raymond stood near the back of the room, his broad frame slightly hunched, as though trying to make himself smaller. Beside him, Noah and Nora sat close, their thin shoulders touching, small fingers tangled deep in Max's fur. The old German shepherd lay still at their feet, eyes half open, his breath slow and steady like the ticking of a tired clock. The benches creaked as people shifted, murmurs rippling through the room before the bailiff called for quiet. The judge, a woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that saw everything, adjusted her glasses and nodded for the hearing to begin. On the opposite side, Ruth Porter sat upright, her expensive coat draped over her shoulders like armor. Glenn sat beside her, staring ahead with the dull pride of a man who had forgotten the difference between power and decency. Ruth's lawyer, a slick man in a navy suit with a voice like polished glass, stood to speak. "Your Honor," he began, "my clients took in these children out of compassion. They provided food, shelter, and schooling. They were blindsided when the minors ran away under the influence of this man, Mr. Cole, who has no legal guardianship, no relation, and no stability to offer. He is a retired soldier, living on a fixed income in an isolated area. These children belong in a structured home." Raymond didn't move, didn't even blink. The words rolled over him like wind against stone. He'd heard worse before, sometimes from men in uniform, sometimes from himself. His hands stayed folded in front of him, the way one might stand before something sacred. Max raised his head slightly, eyes fixed on the lawyer, a faint growl rumbling beneath the calm. Ruth took the stand next. Her perfume hit the air like sugar and vinegar. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that bore no trace of moisture. "We did everything for them," she said, her voice trembling in rehearsed outrage. "They ran away. They had their own rooms, clean clothes, 3 meals a day. I don't understand why they'd leave." Anna Reese sat quietly in the second row, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When Ruth's lawyer tried to push the sympathy angle, Anna leaned forward slightly, a hint of defiance flickering in her eyes. The judge turned to Raymond. "Mr. Cole, do you have anything to say?" He rose slowly, his movement deliberate like a soldier remembering old rituals. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "Not about me." He looked down at Noah and Nora. "They can speak for themselves." The room went still. Even the air seemed to hesitate. The judge nodded. "Very well." Noah stood first. His boots were too big, borrowed from Raymond, and made a soft, scuffing sound against the floor. He looked small beneath the courtroom lights, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "You gave us walls," he said, his gaze fixed on Ruth. "He gave us warmth." Every whisper died at once. Even Ruth froze, the painted smile on her lips faltering. Nora reached for her brother's hand, her small voice following his like a shadow. "He listens when we talk, even when we don't say anything out loud." The judge's eyes softened. "Thank you, children. You can sit." They did. Max leaned his head against Noah's knee, pressing close. His fur absorbed tears before they could fall. Then Clara rose from the front row, her cane tapping against the wood like the slow heartbeat of memory. "Your Honor," she said, her voice quiet but resonant. "I've buried soldiers. I've seen orphans rot in systems that promise care but deliver loneliness. That man," she said, turning toward Raymond, "brought those children back to life. Not with money, not with papers, but with decency. the kind that can't be taught and can't be bought. The judge looked at Raymond again, studying him for a long moment. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "do you understand the responsibility you're asking for?" He nodded once. "I do. But truth is, Your Honor, they've been taking care of me just as much." A long silence followed, one that didn't feel empty, but full, like the air before rain. The judge leaned back in her chair, removed her glasses, and exhaled. Then she lifted the gavel. When it fell, the sound wasn't harsh. It was soft, certain, almost like a blessing. "Custody granted to Mr. Raymond Cole," she said, "effective immediately." The twins gasped. Nora's small hand flew to her mouth. Noah's shoulders trembled, the relief too big for his little frame. Raymond bowed his head once, not in triumph, but in gratitude. Max wagged his tail once, a slow, tired sweep across the polished floor. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. Sunlight broke through the clouds in muted streaks, turning the courthouse steps to mirrors of thawing ice. Reporters had already started to gather near the sidewalk, but Raymond kept his eyes on the children, shielding them from the flashing cameras. "Let's go home," he murmured. They descended the steps together, Max padding ahead, careful but proud. Then, halfway down, it happened. A sudden hesitation, a tremor in the old dog's hind legs. His paw slipped on the wet stone. The sound of claws scraping against marble cut through the chatter. Nora screamed his name. "Max!" Raymond turned just in time to catch him before he fell. The dog's breath came fast, shallow, his body trembling as if the strength that had carried him this far was finally faltering. Noah dropped to his knees, his small hands gripping Max's collar. "He's okay," Raymond said quickly, voice breaking at the edges. "He's just tired. That's all." Clara hurried down, cane clacking, eyes wide with worry. The judge, watching from the doorway above, pressed her lips together, perhaps remembering how even victories can carry weight. For a long moment, no one moved. Snowflakes began to fall again, light and unhurried, landing on Max's fur and melting instantly against the warmth still there. Raymond held him steady until the trembling eased. Then the old dog lifted his head weakly, looked up at Nora, and licked the tears from her cheek. The girl laughed through the sob, the sound fragile but real. Raymond smiled faintly, rubbing Max's shoulder. "Easy, soldier," he whispered. "We're not done yet." And though no one said it aloud, they all knew the truth. Every story of survival comes with a cost, and every hero eventually grows tired. But as they stepped into the light, hand in hand, something about the world felt right again. Briefly, beautifully right. The first true warmth of spring came not with sunlight, but with sound. The slow drip of melting icicles, the creak of wet wood easing under its own thaw. Days had grown longer now, and the valley that once slept under a hard white silence was stirring. Streams sang again through the fields behind Raymond's cabin, and the scent of damp earth replaced the sharp sting of frost. Inside the old barn, hammers clicked, laughter rose, and something beautiful began to take shape. It had started as an idea spoken softly one evening, a promise more than a plan. Raymond had stood by the window, watching the twins paint at the table, and said almost to himself, "Maybe this place could mean something." Weeks later, it did. The barn that once held hay and dust now held life. Its walls were covered with children's drawings, crooked suns, horses, dogs, a cabin by the river. The smell of stew mingled with the faint sweetness of fresh paint. Someone had painted the door yellow, bright as a summer field, and above it hung a small wooden sign carved carefully by Noah. Max's Haven, for kids who got lost in the snow. Visitors came sometimes. Social workers, teachers, a few quiet souls who'd heard about the veteran with the dog and the two children who had nowhere else to go. They brought old clothes, boxes of books, even a set of bunk beds that Clara's neighbor had saved from his youth. Nora had sewn curtains from old quilts, patchwork colors that fluttered like flags of survival. In the evenings, Raymond sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, listening to the hum of voices inside. There was laughter now, unsteady but growing stronger each day. The sound of people remembering how to be unafraid. Max was never far. His muzzle had turned white as the snow that once tried to claim them, his steps slower but still sure. Every morning, he waited at the porch until the twins finished breakfast, tail sweeping the wood in patient rhythm. He no longer chased rabbits or barked at shadows, but he watched the path down to the road as if expecting someone. Maybe another child who'd lost their way. Maybe just the wind carrying familiar voices. His eyes had grown softer, his strength gentler. Clara came often, leaning on her cane, pretending not to notice the ache in her knees. "You've done something rare here, Raymond," she said once, gazing at the barn. "You've built a home that remembers pain but doesn't live in it." He smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting the way a curtain does when light finally enters. "Guess I just needed the right crew." Spring moved slow, stretching itself across the valley, filling every hollow with color. The twins planted flowers along the fence. Wild daisies, small violets, a few stubborn tulips that refused to stay buried. Nora named one patch Hope's Corner. Noah carved a tiny wooden horse to hang above the door. Every mark they left seemed to give the old land something it had missed, proof that joy could come back after too many winters. On the last day of snowmelt, the world was still half gray, half green, that in-between season when the air smells like memory. Raymond found Max under the old oak, lying in a patch of thin sunlight. Nora was there too, her hair tangled in the breeze, one small hand resting on the dog's head. He watched from the porch for a moment, before walking closer, not wanting to break the quiet. "You heard us first, didn't you?" Nora whispered, her voice trembling but certain. The dog's tail thumped once against the grass. His breath was shallow but steady. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead to his neck. Noah sat beside her, silent, his hand curled over Max's paw. Raymond knelt beside them, his knees creaking, his eyes wet though he didn't notice it right away. The sky had begun to turn gold, the kind of color that makes everything look softer. Birds moved through the branches, calling to one another like old friends finding their voices again. Raymond reached out, his hand resting gently on Max's shoulder. "Easy now," he murmured. "You've done your part." For a long while, none of them spoke. The sun slipped slowly behind the hills, spilling light across the barn, the fence, the children, the faithful shape beneath the oak. When the last beam touched his fur, Max let out a small breath, as if the weight of every winter had finally lifted. The world seemed to hold still, even the wind. Raymond looked out across the field. The river shimmered like glass, bending around the hill the way time bends around memory. His voice came low, almost to himself, yet it carried through the quiet. Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. They just listen when no one else does. Nora wiped her eyes, nodding without words. She understood. Noah did too, though he didn't look up. The wind moved then, gentle and certain, stirring the branches overhead. It passed through the grass, through the barn's open door, through every corner of the home they had made together. It sounded, for just a moment, like a whisper, soft, warm, and grateful. Later, when the lamps were lit and the valley folded itself into dusk, Raymond carved another line beneath Noah's sign. He heard them first, and when he stepped back to look, the yellow door glowed faintly in the lantern light, the words above it catching the breeze like a quiet hymn. Somewhere, deep in the stillness, the old oak rustled, and the night answered with the same simple grace it always had. A soft thank you carried by the wind. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They simply grow quieter, until all that's left is the sound of breathing, of wind through trees, of hearts still remembering. Loyalty isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the steady waiting at a porch, the warmth beside a fire, the hand that doesn't let go when the night turns cold. And courage, true courage, rarely announces itself. It walks beside us in silence, wearing the faces of ordinary people who choose kindness even when no one is watching. There are men who fought wars and dogs who never asked why, children who learned to trust again, and souls who built homes from the pieces of their own brokenness. Maybe that's what it means to keep faith in this weary world, not by shouting our goodness, but by carrying it quietly every day until someone else feels safe enough to follow. So when the screen fades and the story slips away, listen closely. In the hush that remains, you might still hear them, the ones who guard what's left of the light.